Getting to the system wasn't the issue. Getting in was. We'd spent nearly a week carefully and stealthily reconnoitering the pirate's little hidey hole, all to come to the conclusion there was only one way in or out. The system was surrounded by a cloud of unstable and destructive energies, kept in place both by the system's gravity and at bay by the force of the star's solar winds, which only served to feed the cloud's energetic and impenetrable nature. The only way in or out was a complex that sat outside the cloud, a massive gate, and along its rings were 4 stations armed to the teeth and automated to annihilate any transgressors with extreme efficiency and speed. We had arranged for a meteor or two to make close passes of the gate to see the ferocity of the defenses were capable of, and while admiring the quality of the challenge in place, we had been left with no clean way to bypass it. That had been until we managed to catch a vessel leaving, a small frigate, bound to who knows where, but armed and mostly empty. Out to pillage and loot most likely. A quick and inspired bit of work from the little ones, and rapidly confirmed by Navi, calculated the course of the vessel and allowed us to preempt their attack on a trade vessel by sending warnings to them. As we waited on the outside of the system that their target was in, we saw the small vessel racing in our direction, now fleeing the fully prepared and ready defenses that they had not expected to run into. As they closed to the edge of the system, unaware of our presence, I was floating silently in my suit, and as the fleeing pirate vessel made the expected course correction to exit the system on a course to safety, I fired my suit's main cannon. The round's configuration was such that when it exploded directly in front of the vessel, the very attempts to slow to avoid the apparent force of the explosion that they did indeed try would only make the disruption of their exclusion fields, and to a lesser extent the cores of those drives themselves, and the loss of momentum even worse. As I began to speed towards the now disabled ship, its crew began firing in the general direction of where my shot had originated, and as I was happily weaving through the heavy, but at this range scattered, attempts to stop my approach, it was only when Masnoa came over the comms that I realized my rookie mistake. "Sarge, you just put the system star at your back. They can see you!" Damn it! As I watched the other side of the frigate open and saw the blooms of 5 elemental burst drives glow as the pirate's response issued forth, I cursed both my oversight and smiled in anticipation. 5 Blastblades flew towards me with haste, in a ripper formation, with their long, segmented blast wings extending outwards. As I shifted my suit into its combat form and drew out Starvine, I aimed with my arm gun and waited for us to be in range of each other. I had them on range and would be able to fire first, but they would also get to fire at least once with their energy cannons before my first salvo landed. And unlike my rounds, which moved at a fraction of the speed of light, their shots would be traveling nearly at the full speed of light itself and would land first. I fired in a rapid in and out spiral pattern, and saw the crimson flashes of their cannons just as I finished firing and brought my arm up and activated the shielding systems. As the beams hit my shield, and the forces of their destructive death battled with the forces of my defenses, I knew this was going to be just a first step to this dance. Welcome my perceptive patrons once more back to the library, where today we're going to take a look at the Dragwa's answer to the question of combat amongst the stars. The Blastblade Combat Starfighter. As always, this will be just a quick look at this adaptation and continuation of the Dragwa's very blunt ways of combat to the battlefield of the vacuum of space. To begin, let us cover in brief the fact that most of the vessels that ply the stars in the realms are of Criterion make and design. This is because, until more recent times, only Criterion had the industrial infrastructure to not only produce space-capable ships, but had been doing so for many years to maintain the Shadow Mirror War. In fact, the great majority of Criterion's production capability went unused for ages, as there was no need before the Age of Stars for anywhere near the number of star vessels they could produce. However, after the Age of Stars began, designs that had been created over years for both civilian and colonial use were put into production. As Criterion designs tend to be very customizable and adjustable, many of the great powers were and are happy to just order their craft from a well-trusted and reliable power, as Criterion is, and then tailor them to suit their own needs. However, there are, as always, exceptions. The Dragwa felt the designs on offer were more than sufficient in many ways, most ways in fact, except for ship-to-ship combat. The Dragwa had identified what they saw as an opening in the tactics and use of personal fighters, not just as distraction and defense strippers, but as a full offensive force, capable of disabling, if not outright destroying ships many times their size. Many years of design and research later, and the Blastblade is the result. A craft that is just as dangerous acting as a defender as an attacker. By the time the Blastblade was ready for production, the home city had procured the rights to one of the many facilities Criterion was now offering to the other great powers, to aid them in the maintenance and production of their own vessels. And thus, the Blastblade's production began in earnest, with pilots being trained and practiced in the armaments of the Blastblade, as well as the unique nature of their most potent form of attack. Roughly 36 foot long, the Blastblade looks like a sharply pointed, hexagonal craft with 3 wings. Armed with a pair of Matter Agidisc cannons on the underside and a single Shatterpoint Storm cannon mounted in front of the pilot, the opening salvos from a wing of Blastblades appear to be stock standard for the realms. And you would be right. The opening and tactics are indeed very much like those employed by the majority of the realms. Overwhelm the shields or other primary defenses, and then strike at exposed weak points or systems. However, once the shields go down, or prove to not be an impediment to the starfighters, the truth of the Blastblades is seen as the fighters will begin to spin. This spin accompanies the extension of the center section of their wings, which will extend to about 20 to 25 feet out in 9 edged and barbed segments. The pilots will then rake across the hull of the target vessel, tearing into it and seeing the segment snagged and pulled off as the pilot continues his run, until optimally they have had all the segments so snagged. Each segment is in reality just a casing for a very powerful explosive, and such it will explode moments after being disconnected from the Blastblade. Each Blastblade has a total of 4 sets of explosive wings, kept in extra-dimensional storage for the safety of the pilot and the craft. The effect of a wing of Blastblades on an enemy vessel can be conflict-ending, as seeing vast amounts of their ship opened up to the cold embrace of space in such a visceral manner has taken the fight out of many a captain. In a dogfighting situation, a single segment snagging can often spell the utter destruction for another craft of similar size, and thus they make for excellent defensive craft as well. As such, it should be no surprise that many mercenary orders of Dragwa, for whom the craft was designed and is exclusively sold to, ply their services across the realms, both wild and civil. This is despite what could be called shortcomings of the design, such as the lack of any sort of what would be considered proper shielding, only having a basic deflection field to deal with space dust and other minor space impediments. Likewise, the Blastblade lacks an exclusion drive of any sort, instead using an elemental engine of the Dragwa's own creation to provide the motive force for the vessel. This drive cannot reach near the speed of light, but for the speeds in which most space combat occurs within the realms, it is in line with most of its contemporaries, if a bit less agile, even with the numerous maneuvering thrusters built into the Blastblade's hull. The relative lack of observation equipment also leaves the Blastblade fairly blind to anyone in their rear, as the output of their engine obscures any rearward sensors. It should also be noted that unlike the vast majority of Realm's craft, especially of this size, the Blastblade is a space-only vessel, and will be very unlikely to be able to recover from falling into the atmosphere of a planet, almost always crashing quite explosively soon after. Many do not see this as an impediment, and are more than happy to find other solutions to atmospheric travel. As said before, the availability of such craft make this merely an inconvenience and logistical issue. They staggered their fire, as to prevent me from getting another salvo off before my first had landed. And as my salvo did land, I saw the fighters break formation, with only the lead craft still on a direct path towards me. None of my shots had properly landed, but the maneuvering was the intent, not damage. As the lead craft continued to speed towards me, I struck out with Starvine and watched as the tip cleanly punched through the pilot's viewport, and knew more than likely it was the impact alone that would end him, even before the tip went through him and into the core of the craft. Acting as a pivot using my engines, the craft began to swing up violently before I retracted Starvine, and the now pilotless craft went flying into the closest of his wingmates, causing both vessels to explode in a cloud of elemental color and force. 2 down. As I began to fly towards the Blastblade that was now alone, with its pilot spinning the craft around while still being carried away from me by the momentum of his previous course, he saw my rapid approach, and the pilot thought better of it and reached down, ejecting the control pod at me like a bullet, seeking to escape the coming destruction of his craft. I had to tumble forward and up to dodge the incoming pod, as the pilot was no longer an active combatant, and I had bigger fish to fry. This left me floating and turning just about the now empty and harmless Blastblade. That is when I was alerted to the fact that the engines were overloading on the Blastblade and about to self-destruct. Bringing my shield to full power between me and the craft, the explosion crumbled my sensors as it flowed like a volcano's eruption around my shield. As it subsided, I saw the other 2 craft make use of a cable of some kind to snag the escaping pilot's pod and begin to burn their way back to the frigate, as the supporting fire that was ineffectively but consistently trying to aid them stopped. It appears they thought I had died in the explosion, and between the composition of my suit shell and the interference of the explosion themselves, they couldn't detect me. I realized the opportunity I had, and I jetted off behind them, careful to stay in the concealing bloom of their engines as I used them for cover to close the distance to them, and then with them to the ship. As I cleared the bulk of the disruption caused by the Blastblade's self-destruction, I sent a simple update to the Night Rock. Change of plans. Void in shadow. Wait for contact. VIS confirmed. Good luck. And with today's entry coming to a close, I hope you can see what makes the Blastblades such a unique craft within the realms, and a fearsome prospect for those that face them. As always, I have been the Recorder, and before you go, my perceptive patrons, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your time and your interest. Thank you. Now, until you next visit the library for another entry, by the 9 and 4. Be well, take care of yourselves and each other.